September 1944. A muddy tree line near Arracourt, France. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and spent cordite. Bullets snap through the branches. An American platoon huddles in shallow foxholes as a German counterattack surges toward their thin line. The soldiers reach into their belts, feeling for clips that are no longer there. A young sergeant crawls through the muck, his face streaked with grease and sweat, shouting for more ammunition. He expects crates of rifle rounds and belts for the machine guns. Instead, he finds an officer holding a clipboard. The officer is not looking at the enemy. He is looking at a ledger. He demands a precise count of every remaining round before a single bullet is released. It is a moment of administrative madness in the middle of a slaughter. Patton's response would ensure that no soldier ever died with an empty rifle because of a clerk's ego. This is the story of a company commander who treated bullets like dollars, and a general who reminded him that the cost of caution is often paid in blood. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when ego outranked experience. This is the account of how Patton dismantled a lethal bureaucracy to ensure his soldiers had the tools they needed to fight. Staff Sergeant Marcus Torres was 28 years old and came from the dusty, hard scrabble outskirts of El Paso, Texas. He served with the 4th Armored Division, a unit that had spent the last 2 months carving a path through the French countryside. Torres was a man of quiet competence who had been a foreman at a local ranch before the war. He knew how to manage men, and he knew the value of a job done right. He had lost his younger brother at Anzio, a blow that left him with a deep, protective streak for the soldiers under his command. He didn't care about medals or citations. He cared about bringing his boys home. To Torres, every minute spent away from his fighting position was a minute the enemy had to gain an advantage. On that morning in September, he found himself doing the one thing he hated most, wasting time while his men were dying. Captain Walter Briggs was 35 years old and hailed from a wealthy neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut. Before the draft, he had been a rising star at a prestigious accounting firm. He brought that same ledger-driven mentality to the European theater of operations. Briggs was a man of absolute order who viewed the chaos of war as a problem of poor organization. He wore a tailored uniform that looked as though it had never seen a day of rain, and he kept a set of fountain pens lined up perfectly on his field desk. He believed that the primary duty of an officer was the stewardship of government property. In his mind, a missing crate of ammunition was not just a supply error, it was a moral failing. He had once court-martialed a supply clerk for a minor discrepancy in gasoline records. He viewed the battlefield not as a place of grit and sacrifice, but as a series of balance sheets that needed to be reconciled. He was convinced that his rigid accounting would be his legacy. Instead, it became a death sentence for 4 men under his command. By September 1944, the Allied dash across France had hit a wall of logistics and mud. The rapid advance following the breakout from Normandy had stretched supply lines to the snapping point. Fuel was scarce, and ammunition was becoming a precious currency. In the Lorraine region, the American Third Army faced a revitalized German defense. The enemy was no longer retreating in a panic. They were digging in, counterattacking with panzers, and using the dense forests and rolling hills to trap advancing American columns. The Battle of Arracourt was becoming a testament to armored warfare, but on the ground, for the infantry and the support crews, it was a gritty struggle for every yard of dirt. The chaos of the front lines meant that official channels were often bypassed in favor of survival. Most officers understood that the reality of a firefight did not match the regulations of a training manual. They looked the other way when a sergeant requisitioned extra rations or when a tank commander borrowed fuel from a neighboring unit. Efficiency was measured in ground gained and lives saved, not in paperwork. However, the breakdown of traditional military structure allowed a different kind of problem to emerge. Men like Briggs, who had spent their lives governed by the rigid certainty of numbers, found the unpredictability of combat intolerable. They sought to impose order on the carnage through the only means they knew: administrative control. In the eyes of the high command, the war was a machine that required constant lubrication of steel and lead. But at the company level near Arracourt, that machine was grinding to a halt because a commander viewed his inventory as more important than his mission. The line between careful management and lethal negligence had been crossed, And the cost was about to be tallied in human lives. Sergeant Torres sprinted back to the company command post, his boots sliding in the thick French mud. Mortar rounds were walking their way toward the platoon line, and the rhythmic thumping of a German MG-42 grew louder by the second. He burst into the cellar where the supply sergeant sat behind a makeshift desk. Torres slammed his hands down on the wood. "We are out of belts for the heavy machine gun," he shouted. "I need 3 crates of .30 caliber and a case of grenades right now." The supply sergeant didn't move. He looked at a clipboard, then at Captain Briggs, who was sitting in the corner meticulously cleaning his fingernails. The supply sergeant cleared his throat. The captain standing order, "Sergeant, I need the expenditure report and a remaining count before I can release more stores." Torres stared at him in disbelief. "Are you kidding me? There is a German company coming through the tree line. My men are down to their last clips. I don't have time to count bullets. I have time to shoot them." Captain Briggs looked up, his eyes cold and uninterested in the noise of the battle outside. "Sergeant, accountability is the bedrock of a disciplined unit. This ammunition is government property. If I don't know exactly what you've used, I cannot justify the request for more. Every round must be tracked." Torres leaned over the desk, his voice shaking with a mix of rage and desperation. "Sir, with all due respect, my machine gunner is staring at an empty belt. If that gun stays silent, the Germans are going to walk right over us. We will all be dead, and nobody will be left to sign your damn papers." Briggs stood up and smoothed his jacket. "Then you should have managed your fire discipline more effectively. Count what you have. Report it, then you will get your resupply. Not a second before." Torres turned and ran back to the foxholes. He spent 20 minutes crawling from man to man, counting individual brass casings and remaining clips while lead snapped over his head. By the time he dragged the count back to the cellar, the silence from the tree line was terrifying. The American machine gun had run dry. The Germans had used the gap to rush the position. 4 of Torres's men were already dead in their holes, bayoneted or shot at point-blank range because they had nothing left to fire. The supply sergeant finally handed over the crates. But it was too late. The position was a graveyard. The report of the massacre, and the reason behind it, reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep roared into the company area less than an hour later. The vehicle had barely stopped before the general was out, his boots hitting the mud with a heavy, purposeful thud. He wore his full-service uniform, the 4 stars on his helmet gleaming even under the gray, overcast sky. The ivory-handled revolvers at his hips were unmistakable. He did not yell. He did not storm into the cellar. He simply walked in, and the air seemed to vanish from the room. Every soldier present snapped to attention, their eyes fixed forward, paralyzed by the sudden presence of a man who looked like war incarnate. Patton ignored the supply sergeant and walked straight to Captain Briggs, who stood behind his desk, his face pale against his polished collar. Patton looked at the captain for a long, silent moment, his gaze as sharp as a bayonet. "Did you issue the order requiring a physical count of ammunition before resupply during active contact?" Patton asked. His voice was high, thin, and terrifyingly calm. Briggs swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence. "Yes, General," he replied. "I believe in maintaining strict accountability of government property. It is my duty to ensure no resources are wasted." Patton tilted his head slightly. "And while your sergeant was counting those resources, where was the enemy?" Briggs hesitated. "They were attacking our perimeter, sir." Patton stepped closer, his shadow falling over the captain's ledger. "So, you prioritized the accounting of brass over the lives of the men using it?" Briggs straightened his back, trying to reclaim some shred of his former confidence. "I was following standard administrative procedures for supply management, General. I cannot be held responsible for the tactical outcome of a deficit I was trying to prevent through proper oversight." Patton's eyes narrowed. "You think this is an office in Connecticut, Captain. You think the Army is a business, and the soldiers are just line items on a balance sheet. You are wrong. The most expensive and irreplaceable government property under your command is not the bullet. It is the man who fires it. You have a choice. You can keep your ledger and your desk, or you can keep your commission. You chose to count pennies while your men were paying in blood. You spent 20 minutes on paperwork that cost me 4 soldiers. In combat, ammunition flows forward until the shooting stops. You count the remnants after the funeral, not before the fight. You will hand that clipboard to Sergeant Torres. You will then report to the front line with a rifle, since you are so concerned with expenditure. You will spend your own life defending the hole those 4 men died in. Pick up a weapon or face a firing squad for cowardice and criminal negligence. Decide now." Briggs looked at the general, then at the dirt, his hands trembling as he realized the numbers finally refused to add up in his favor. The transfer of authority was as silent as it was absolute. Captain Briggs handed over the clipboard with hands that shook so violently the papers fluttered like dying birds. Sergeant Torres took the ledger, his knuckles white against the wood, and watched as the man who had been his commander was stripped of his dignity in front of the entire company. 2 MPs, their helmets dull in the rain, stepped forward and took Briggs by the arms. They did not treat him with the respect due an officer. They treated him like a crate of faulty equipment being moved to the scrap heap. Under Patton's cold, unblinking stare, they marched Briggs through the muck and toward the very ridge where the machine gun had fallen silent. The smell of the dead still hung in the damp air, a heavy, metallic scent that seemed to choke the disgraced captain as he was forced into the blood-stained foxhole. The other soldiers watched from their positions, their faces masks of grim satisfaction. There was no cheering. There was only the sound of Briggs sobbing as he was handed a Garand rifle and told to watch the tree line. The man who had lived by the pen was now forced to survive by the sword, standing guard over the very ground where his obsession with accounting had turned living men into statistics. Staff Sergeant Marcus Torres survived the war, though the memory of those 4 empty machine gun belts never left him. He returned to El Paso in 1945 and went back to the ranching life he had known before the world caught fire. He married a local girl and raised 3 sons, but his neighbors noted that he never once allowed a ledger or a formal inventory in his home. He managed his business by handshake and trust, believing that numbers were a poor substitute for the character of a man. He died in 1992, surrounded by grandchildren who knew him only as a quiet man with a deep respect for the value of a single day. Walter Briggs did not die in the foxhole at Arracourt. He survived the night, though he suffered severe frostbite and a nervous breakdown that ended his military career. He was quietly discharged for medical reasons and returned to Connecticut in early 1946. He attempted to return to the world of high finance, but the precision he once loved now terrified him. Every time he picked up a pen to balance a column of figures, he reportedly saw the faces of the 4 men he had effectively traded for a line of ink. He lived a reclusive life, moving from one administrative job to another, never staying long enough to make an impression. He passed away in 1981, leaving behind a storage unit filled with thousands of pages of personal journals, every one of them containing nothing but lists of supplies he had managed decades prior. Patton never officially recorded the incident in his memoirs, but he did keep a small, blood-stained ammunition requisition form in the bottom drawer of his field desk until the end of the campaign. He once told a close aide that the greatest sin a commander could commit was confusing the tools of war with the purpose of war. He believed that an army could always manufacture more bullets, but it could never manufacture more time or more souls. To Patton, the ledger at Arracourt was a reminder that even in a war of millions, the individual soldier remained the only currency that truly mattered. Some historians argue that Patton's treatment of Briggs was a breach of military protocol and that his dismissal of administrative procedures undermined the long-term logistical health of the Army. They contend that accountability is necessary to prevent the very shortages the platoon was experiencing. However, other scholars argue that Patton understood the psychological and tactical necessity of prioritizing the immediate crisis over the secondary concern of bookkeeping. They maintain that his decisive intervention saved lives by establishing a precedent that human life was the military's most vital resource. What is certain is that the directive Patton issued that day remained in effect throughout the campaign, ensuring that no American position under fire would ever again be paralyzed by a requirement to count its bullets while being shot at. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have simply disciplined the captain later through official channels? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when ego outranked experience, make sure to subscribe.